Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be taking a look at the Huawei P20 smartphone, which of course is the successor to last year's P10. So we're going to start things out by looking at the aesthetics of the phone and then move over to features, camera performance and a whole bunch more stuff, and then give the verdict. Is this phone worthy of the 600 Great British pounds that Huawei are asking for this? Well, let's start things out with the aesthetics then. To me anyway, this is a fairly nice looking smartphone. The physical buttons are satisfying to press and the phone doesn't feel cheap or flimsy in the hand, and at 165 grams, to me anyway, it feels around perfect. It doesn't feel too heavy, but also feels satisfying enough to hold. And speaking of holding the phone, the actual texture of the phone, as well as the way it's designed, does fit my hand rather perfectly. I do have larger hands than perhaps many people, but still, I've asked a couple of other people to hold the phone as well, and they've said that they've had no particular issues. It's not quite a phablet by any stretch of the imagination. After all, the screen is only 5.8 inches total, but it still is a pretty large device. If I were forced to put any criticisms on the phone, it would be the slightly raised edges for the camera, which of course is required simply because of the design of the camera, but still it can feel a little bit weird when you're holding it if your finger happens to touch the area and you're not used to it, but certainly it's nothing terrible to live with. And perhaps could be an issue after much usage, and that is the raised edges of the bezels, which I do suspect could be a dirt trap. Not, once again, a terrible problem or anything like that, and if you keep the phone clean, it's not going to certainly be a big problem. But if you do work in a dirtier environment, it is something to take into consideration.
The screen of the phone is 5.8 inches at 1080 by 2244, meaning 428 ppi. This does mean a fairly strange aspect ratio, and some content, for example 16:9 YouTube videos, may need to be zoomed in if you don't want black borders. Oh, and speaking of borders, some folks may really dislike the notched aesthetic, which of course is simply a function of trying to pack so much stuff into a limited form factor of a cell phone. Huawei did make a rather smart decision, as they allow you to enable or disable the notch based upon a personal preference. The first thing I did was disable the notch, still providing ample on-screen real estate. However, after a while I did decide to experiment and re-enabled it, and after a couple of days I became used to it and then just left it on. I just preferred it. Huawei also provides options for you to adjust the color temperature of the screen depending upon the environment. You can go with a more vivid and normal set of colors, or warm or cold, depending on your personal preference and of course the environment itself and the content that you're watching. Another option is you're allowed to bump down the resolution of the screen. This of course has the obvious side effect of reducing the power consumption of the battery. Overall, the TFT LCD display is rather nice, and in brightly lit areas or outside, you're certainly not going to be squinting to look at the text on screen, but perhaps it could be just a little bit brighter. This brings us on to media content such as YouTube videos and Netflix. You'll notice that at the bottom of the phone there are two sets of drilled holes, so you can be forgiven for thinking that that means there are two speakers. This is not the case, it is just a single speaker design. Fortunately, the single speaker does do a fairly good job, at least in terms of the volume and loudness, but can have slight distortion on very extreme bass and treble sounds. Certainly nothing you're going to notice in everyday listening, but it can crop up occasionally. There is also no 3.5mm jack as well, so you either get to enjoy the sound via the built-in speaker, a USB-C set of headphones, or wireless headphones. But media and gaming is certainly a snappy experience. The Huawei Kirin 970, which has 4 processor cores running at 2.36 GHz and another 4 which run at 1.8 GHz, is snappy enough. And this is combined with 4 GB of RAM and a rather generous 128 GB of storage, so you're not going to have too much issues with games, multitasking and general phone usage. And Geekbench and other benchmarks paint the phone in a fairly good light. It certainly isn't going to match the more expensive and top performing phones on the market, but it should be more than sufficient for most users. By far, one of the strongest feature sets of this phone is the camera functionality though. This phone is absolutely amazing if you are an amateur photographer, or perhaps you just want a secondary camera in case your main one dies and runs out of battery, or just in general. The camera setup is fairly simple: dual cameras on the rear and a single selfie camera. And I have to say that the photos that this camera produces, just in auto mode, are very impressive. The camera actually uses artificial intelligence to identify the subject matter of a photo, so it will be able to identify whether it's taking a photo of a dog or a car and so on and so on. This means that you get absolutely beautiful photos with relatively little effort. It goes without saying that there are the usual options: high dynamic range, panorama, light painting, video shooting modes, pro modes, and much more besides. And perhaps more importantly, you can take photos in the RAW format. And finally, we need to discuss battery life. After all, you don't want the phone dying halfway through the day. Unfortunately, this is not the case. It packs a 3400 mAh battery and fast charging, although there is no wireless charging here. Watching an entire feature film, depending on the brightness you have the display set at, could drain around 25 or 30% of the power from the device. But, with that said, with normal day-to-day usage, Facebook and social media, browsing the internet, and of course just having the phone on idle, it's very much a case where I was left with 40, 50, 60% of the battery. And once again, there are certainly a myriad of battery conservation options, including the ability to lower the resolution of the display.
So then, what about the verdict? Should you purchase this smartphone? Inevitably, the comments of this video are going to point out the allegations of Huawei and their tampering with various benchmark results for the phone. But there are a couple of things here. One, Huawei are not the only company who have done that. Several other vendors, we all know who they are, have done very similar. Not just in smartphones either. Let's just be clear about that. That's not to say that we should say that, well, you know, all's forgiven, but it is just something to bear in mind that they are not the only ones who have done this. Pretty much all of the companies have. The second thing is that while the initial results were slightly overblown in proportion, this phone is still very impressive in terms of overall performance. And as I just mentioned, in games and general applications, it is more than fast enough, despite the initial faked benchmarks. Honestly, this phone is still very impressive. With that all said, I don't have particular issues recommending this phone. It's not perfect. The fact that it is not waterproof is definitely a black mark against it. And if you are someone that does want that 3.5mm jack, well, that's definitely going to be an issue as well. It is something I personally dislike about the phone as well. But other than that, it is a pretty darn nice phone indeed. The camera functionality is really nice. It's definitely one of the shining beacons of this device. And as I mentioned earlier, if you are looking for a device which is pretty darn awesome as a secondary camera, this phone might be for you, unless you're going to go for a much more expensive device. But obviously we're talking two different leagues here. The P20 Pro, for example, has 3 cameras and does an even better job with photography, but after all, it's not competing in that league. It is a different price point. Overall, this phone is really nice. It is not perfect, but what phone is? But for the price, particularly if you can get a good deal from a cell phone provider, then I would highly recommend at least checking out. Go to a showroom, try out the phone and see what you think. With all of that said, I'd also like to point out this is not a sponsored video. All opinions are our own. We were sent this device for the purposes of review, but no money was exchanged hands, and once again, all opinions are our own. With all that said, take care of yourselves, and if you've enjoyed the video, you know what to do. You can click the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon, because the subscribe button isn't quite as good as it used to be for some reason or another. So you can press the notification button and you'll actually get the things that the subscribe button used to do. And with all that said, take care of yourselves. Bye for now.